Morning, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We had a few technical difficulties, so we were unable to do the live webcast, but thanks to our genius staff here at the Wilson Center, they have sorted out, and we're ready to go. First of all, Happy New Year to everybody. This is our first event at the Mexico Institute, so we're delighted to see you here. Not the most auspicious of circumstances, I know, with a federal shutdown, or partial, I guess. But we're very, very glad that people came out on a cold morning. I just want to say a few things about the paper that we're presenting today. This is a conversation that Eric, myself, and other members of the team have been having for a couple of years about where do we go next with security cooperation between Mexico and the United States. And we were debating how best to do it. We talked about perhaps writing a whole book about the issue. We then talked about a single-authored paper. And ultimately, in the fall of last year, excuse me, I'm getting emotional. In the fall of last year, we decided to pull together a group of experts, both from the United States and from Mexico, here at the Wilson Center. And we included some congressional staffers who had expressed interest in the issue. And we discovered in the process that there are moves up on Capitol Hill to try to redefine the Merida Initiative and security cooperation between Mexico and the United States. And so this was a timely exercise. We had input from experts from academia, experts from government, experts who work in the field. The process itself was very much a brainstorming process, and it worked exceptionally well. Not everybody agreed with everything that was said. Not everybody agreed with what is in the final paper. However, I think that this is actually an accurate reflection of the main ideas that came forward during that brainstorming process. I do believe it's an important contribution to the conversation. It's by no means definitive, of course. This is sort of an opening shot in the conversation, I think, about where we go next. We would very much appreciate your feedback, both in this session and if you'd like to send written remarks afterwards, that would be great because it will help us to improve our work. And of course, we also need to repeat this conversation down in Mexico. Whilst we were lucky enough to have some representatives from Mexico at the table, we'd like to broaden the conversation down there. Before I pass the microphone over to Eric, let me just say that we're deeply indebted to Chemonics International, who co-sponsored the event and who played a very big role in helping us to shape the conversation. And Enrique Betancourt, who unfortunately is not here with us today, has shown a great deal of leadership on that, and we're grateful to him. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Eric, who is the mastermind behind this report. And let me, of course, also say thank you to Maureen and to Indigo, who are very dear friends of the Mexico Institute. We're very grateful for all that you do for us on a repeated basis. Eric.
Thank you very much, Duncan. And in usual style, Duncan is very modest about what his contribution has been to this project. So I just want to say a word of thanks to you for keeping this agenda, this item or this issue on the agenda, bringing it up constantly, saying what are we doing on this, and really being generous with funding and support for these kinds of initiatives. So thank you, Duncan. I really appreciate that. And then I realized I didn't grab the bios to introduce both of my friends. Oh, there they are. Well, I'm going to ignore it anyway because both Maureen and Indigo are good friends for many, many, many years. So rather than recite all their accomplishments, I'll just say that Maureen is a senior associate or vice president or something at the Washington office on Latin America. Has really been the person here in Washington that's followed in great detail the whole justice reform, criminal procedural reform over the last decade in Mexico. And so I've invited her. She participated in our discussions, but I've invited her to talk about that and other issues related to the rule of law, human rights in Mexico. And then Inigo Guevara from Jane's Defense is a specialist on, obviously, security matters and defense. Here at the Wilson Center, he's helped us enormously in the area of the military relations, understanding the Mexican military, where it's headed. We've done numerous events and papers with him, and so also that's a critical element of this discussion. May not be reflected adequately in this paper, so I wanted to invite Indigo to participate as one of our longtime partners. Obviously, this is a really interesting moment in Mexico. I'm sure you've seen the headlines, people standing in line, long hours and time, waiting to get gasoline to fuel their cars and be able to move around. This is directly related to the issues of organized crime in Mexico and how they have been able to seize and impact people's daily lives. You know, when it comes to an illicit economy, which is, in this case, siphoning off fuel and creating a black market for fuel in Mexico. And I think that case is really interesting. We could spend a whole 2 hours just dissecting that, but I think it's a good reminder of a few things, that we're not talking only about drugs. We have to be broader in our approach to these questions in Mexico, that there is a variety of illicit economies that organized crime takes advantage of, and so we should be thoughtful about that sort of thing. It also reminds us of the problems and limitations of federal deployment. Obviously, deploying to protect the pipelines that are being tapped are important, but what's the role of local governments, state governments, municipal governments, so on and so forth? That's also clear in this particular example. It also helps. We also are aware that Mexico has gone through an amazing period of high homicide rates. Not all homicides in Mexico are the result of transnational criminal organizations, but clearly criminal organizations, organized crime is having a profound impact on people's daily lives, especially if you live in particular red zones or hot zones or high priority zones. I think that's, you know, indisputable that organized crime is playing a major role in that. And so in the context of all this, Andrés Manuel was elected. Andrés Manuel López Obrador was elected last July with a strong mandate to deal with the issues of corruption, organized crime, high levels of violence. Obviously, to deal with other things as well. I don't want to just focus on those, but that was very much a part of that mandate to begin to address these issues. People expressed dissatisfaction with what had come before, the strategies that were employed before. And so part of our exercise is to try to take a new look at a lot of these issues and put forward some new ideas. It also happens that we're 11 years into the Merida Initiative, which was the framework for security cooperation. And so, as Duncan said, we thought it was a good opportunity to begin to re-look at that, rethink it. People in Congress are anxious to do that. I spoke yesterday with somebody who said, you know, we've been funding these programs for 11 years. What are we getting for it? What impact is it having? And so people are hoping that there's some new ideas, new approaches. And that's kind of the context, the background into which we undertook this exercise. Now, as in all these, what do I want to say, challenges, there's a balance between having a 30,000-foot view and getting down to the micro level. And I have to confess that this paper and our view, our proposals here are not down to the nitty-gritty of all these issues. It's really impossible for us to do that. But we've tried to take some big picture points of view and suggest ways in which the policy can be reoriented, not ripped up and thrown out the window, but how do we rethink some of these pressing issues before us. And so I'm going to just go through some of the main points, not all of them in detail. Some Maureen and Indigo will help us dive in a little deeper on some of these issues, but there's always things that we kind of miss in the process, so bear with us. I want to also start by saying that there was broad consensus in our group, and as we talk about this with people, the need to reaffirm the strategy or the framework of shared responsibility. Amongst us, there's no desire to return to finger-pointing approach of saying, you know, Mexico is not doing enough, the U.S. is not doing enough, it's their fault, why aren't they stopping the drugs? The U.S. would say, Mexico might say, well, why are you still consuming so much? I think those approaches are kind of in the past, and we would like to keep it that way and move ahead within this framework of shared responsibility, and there's a lot of affirmation of that in our discussions. But within that framework of shared responsibility, there are a number of things that we think we need to look anew again at. And so let me just highlight some of those. First, rethinking strategies for combating organized crime and drug policy. This was a promise of the López Obrador administration in his campaign. This is a promise he's maintained. But what does that really mean, and what do we think needs to happen in that context? We highlighted a number of issues within that that area that I will just simply mention as priority areas. Understanding the risk of fragmentation of organized crime group. I think there was there's a feeling, I'm sorry, I need to, there's a feeling that not enough thought has been given to the unintended consequences of bringing down some of the kingpin, the leaders. There's been a strong focus on Chapo Guzman, some of the leaders of the organizations. Nobody is saying they should get a pass. We don't care about those people who are doing great damage. But the strategy needs to go beyond that and look broader, more broadly at the risks of fragmentation and increased competition between organized crime groups. Many times we see an explosion of violence when there's fragmentation and increased competition between smaller offshoots and organizations. So keeping that in mind is certainly very important. Again, and secondly, understanding the structures and business models of organized crime. I've alluded to that already. We have to certainly keep in mind that organized crime it has multiple ways in which they are organized as illicit businesses. Some are focused on moving drugs, obviously, from south to north, but others are focused much more locally at extraction of wealth, of income from particular locations, control de plaza, territorial control, is a different model. And like I've already mentioned, the so-called huachicoleros, the thieves that are literally draining oil from the state oil company. Estimates from the president, I think, were in the realm of $3.6 billion lost last year to these people. This is a different model, and we need to have a sophisticated understanding of how the organized crime groups are organized and what their business model is and how we can attack that. Some more ideas on that later on. Let me just say that in other areas within this heading, we've talked about increasing intelligence sharing. The intelligence community in Mexico is undergoing major reform, restructuring, and so we expressed concern, and I'm going to let Indigo discuss this, but that the level of intelligence sharing between the United States and Mexico not be weakened or in any way reduced as a product of this institutional restructuring of intelligence along the way. And then one other issue is drug reform. Andrés Manuel has put on the table the possibility of legalization of some of the illicit substances, of amnesties for people that have been caught up in the drug trade, illicit drug trade. I think in general, people feel, and I'm not saying there's a consensus here, that these conversations about legalization, regulation, and amnesties have to take place in a context of strong rule of law and regulatory capacity. And this is one of the areas that Mexico has struggled with enormously. That's why this next point, which is to focus on institution building, is so important. If you're going to have legalization, which ultimately needs a strong regulatory capacity to ensure that even when drugs are legal, they don't reach children, for example. They're not reaching populations that should not have access to them. This is the element that's missing. It's not simply a matter of legalization, but also the matter of accountability for misuse or violating the regulations and enforcing regulations. So that is certainly important. And finally, in this section, I would just mention quickly the issue of firearms trafficking. This has not been so much on the agenda in the last administration. I know that it continues to be a major concern for Mexico in general, but it hasn't been at the forefront of that agenda. And let me just say that in the 5 years between 2011 and 2016, Mexican law enforcement recovered up to 106,000 firearms, más o menos, as they say, but around 106,000 is the estimate. Of those that were traced, 70% had an origin in the United States, were purchased in the United States. So this is a reminder that firearms trafficking to Mexico continues to be really important and a contributor to the lethality of all these conflicts in Mexico. So we propose a series of issues that Mexico can take to improve this issue and how they approach it, but also the responsibility clearly falls to the United States as well to try to address the issue of trafficking of firearms into Mexico, and it's certainly not enough of a priority on the part of the United States as well. The second main point, and I'll move on quickly here, so don't despair, but we also highlighted the importance of maintaining a focus on strengthening of security institutions to make them more democratic, more transparent, and more accountable. There's been a focus on the police and police reform and police modernization that has been primarily, I won't say exclusively, focused on the federal police and the capacities of the federal police. But little has been done at the local and state levels to strengthen their capacities. And so we on the one hand, are saying that needs to be more of a priority, which is another element in this plan. But also we can't assume, which has been on the agenda for a long time, that simply collapsing or creating unified command structures and making everybody part of the federal police force is going to magically solve the problems of lack of capacity, lack of ability to deal with organized crime at a local level. Also on the justice sector, and I'm going to defer here a lot to Maureen, but a continuation of the reform, the criminal justice reform, seems very important to us. It might appear as a no-brainer from this perspective that, of course, we should see criminal justice reform, but there is clearly pushback in Mexico on this front, a sense that the reforms have been in place basically since 2006, 2008, that the implementation process of judicial reform was concluded in 2016, and yet there are still problems, and so there's at times despair. Let's go back to the old system because this isn't working. And I think we want to push back against that. Yes, there are problems in this new system, but the process of implementation and making that part of the criminal justice system will take longer than 10 years. It will take a lifetime, quite frankly, and that is an important element. There are specifics there that Maureen will address, but I'll leave it at that. Third, refocus on local challenges. I've mentioned this already in terms of the police. The focus has been on modernizing the federal police, not so much on local and state police, strengthening local prosecutors has not been as much of a priority. And I think as a matter of policy, of strategic focus, there needs to be a shift towards rebuilding the state at the local level. It's fine to deploy federal forces to protect a pipeline, to slow down extreme violence in places like Acapulco or Michoacan, but those federal deployments have limited impact there. They may settle down the violent situation, they may slow things down, but unless you rebuild the capacities locally, I mean both municipal and state levels, the problems will persist. That's what organized crime takes advantage of, the weakness of the state at the local level. It's where they take root and grow. And so we are proposing that we rebuild local and state capacities, not overlook the importance of fighting local crime. It's not all transnational crime that impacts locally, and also the importance of an integrated strategy that brings together both federal, state, and municipal authorities to solve a problem locally. A couple years ago, the Latin America program had an event on successful experiences in public security in the region, right? And all of those experiences, and there are some, surprisingly, sometimes we forget, but there are some successful experiences, but those experiences are all local. It's Medellin, it's Cali, it's outside of Santiago, Chile, it's places in Uruguay and Argentina. You don't say suddenly the nation as a whole becomes safe and secure and you focus on the municipalities. Doesn't mean it's only the responsibility of the municipality or the state. It means that all levels of government and the international community come together around a local strategy to reestablish the rule of law, safety, security, and local capacity. When I was in Medellin not too long ago, that was the message of people there. We locally were empowered, they said, but we had the support of the international and the federal government to rebuild things in Medellin. And I think that's the approach that's been lacking thus far. There's been too much of a top-down approach to this. I will acknowledge the U.S. assistance and Mexico has tried and done some things locally. It's not like it's never been done, never been thought of, but we're just saying this is a time to prioritize those things. Fourth, and there are only 5, so we're coming to the end here. Fourth, I think we all acknowledge that reducing violence is really a priority. Many times in the past, people would either say violence is a symptom and so we don't need to worry about it. I even heard people argue that increases in violence was good news because it meant that organizations were being weakened and fractured, and so they didn't pose the kind of threat they did in the past. I think we're prepared, huh?
When they were nonviolent.
When they were nonviolent, right. I think now we have to, and this is my own strong opinion, we have to recognize that extreme violence really is disruptive, destructive to society, to economies, to families, every level. And so it needs to be a priority in and of itself. We can't just ignore the violence. So we have come up with a series of things, proposals that we think are important in the process of reducing violence. Reducing violence doesn't mean the problem has disappeared. We acknowledge that. You know, I think there's this notion that if you reduce violence, everything will go away. No, organized crime can be quite nonviolent, actually. There's a lot of organized crime in Asia, but they're not as violent as they are in Mexico or Central America. But ignoring violence that tears at people's lives and livelihoods is also not acceptable. It's inappropriate, and so we need to make that a greater priority in that process. Fifth and finally, and I'll leave it with on that, is this addressing the challenges of Central America are certainly an element. Now, much of the discussion thus far has been around migration and how one manages borders and manages migration. We didn't look at that so much. This was not a migration group, but certainly understanding the connections to organized crime and violence in Central America, addressing those issues together, United States and Mexico with Central America, has got to be fundamental to this process. It will have an impact on migration, but I think it's also part and parcel of the weakening of the state in Central America, that organized crime has become so powerful, penetrated even presidencies and presidential offices in that region, so it behooves all of us to deal with it. So let me just conclude with three big points here that I think we want to just underscore. First, again, as I said at the beginning, we want to reaffirm that we're in this whole thing together. This is not a Mexico problem. This is a U.S., Mexico, any to that extent, Central American challenge. We have to have, secondly, we have to have a more complex and nuanced approach to criminal organizations and reducing violence. We can't approach this only as a drug trafficking problem, only as a TCO, transnational criminal organization problem. There are elements that are local, that are specific to certain economies, and we need to have a very diversified and multi-dimensional approach to dealing with them. And third and finally is the issue or the concept of sustainability. One of the problems we've all had, and frankly I get desperate about, is that we're constantly relearning the same lessons, constantly putting the same issues on the agenda, and there's not any sense of sustainability on the reforms over a period of time. Each new government, and this happens with the U.S. as much as Mexico, has a new plan, and they're going to reinvent the wheel, and unfortunately, that undermines the sustainability of good policies. That's why, for example, continued support for criminal justice reform in Mexico is so important. We can't just point to the frustrations and the annoyances of it and then try to start over again. We need to in these cases, stay the course and deepen the commitment to criminal justice reform. So I'll leave it at that, ask Maureen and then Indigo to make some comments, add to the discussion before we open it up to all of you.
Let me just say before you start, Maureen, thank you, Eric. And that's why think tanks are so important, and that's why we stay in business, is because, you know, we remember the last time we had this conversation.
Right.
Maureen.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Duncan. Thanks to the Mexico Institute for pulling this together and to having the meeting last fall, I think October, if I remember, to really talk about this. And thinking about longer term, I remember we had a conversation probably 2008 or 9 about similar things, looking at challenges facing Mexico, and a lot of the same things are still on the table. I wanted to touch on two aspects of Mexico's criminal justice system, both on the criminal justice reforms and where they are, but then the more recent changes, actually today likely, on the Fiscal General, Mexico's transformation of its Federal Attorney General's office to a more autonomous, independent national prosecutor's office, and what that means and how the U.S. could be effectively engaged in that process. On the criminal justice reforms, and I think what Eric alluded to, there's still a long way to go to really having the 2008 reforms, which are, I think, a historic reform and overhaul of Mexico's criminal justice system, really rethinking the system that was a primarily inquisitorial written-based system to transforming to an oral trial adversarial system where you have, you know, arguments heard in court and judgments based on scientifically based evidence and cross-examination. And I think particularly even reforms to Mexico's constitution to make the presumption of innocence until proven guilty as a key element of the process. Very important reforms, but still very far off. The Mexican think tank Mexico Evalúa, which is sort of merged with CDAC, who had historically done this work, has an annual report, hallazgos, on progress made on criminal justice reforms. Their last report from the summer estimated that it will still take another decade for the criminal justice reforms to be fully operational in the country. And I think this is really important because as López Obrador's government moves forward on their agenda of wanting to address violence, corruption, human rights violations, you need a functioning criminal justice system. I think one of the concerns we've seen in the national plan on peace and security is that there really hasn't been so far from his administration a stated priority on focusing on judicial reform, strengthening the system, working for strengthening a new fiscalia. And in contrary, it's mostly, I think, in some parts focused on increasing penalties for crimes, which are certainly not necessarily the best way to really get a dent at the widespread impunity in Mexico, which is still estimated to be about, depending on numbers, 87% throughout the country in terms of overall impunity rates. At least that's what Mexico Evalúa was calculating in their more recent report. I think also why this is important is because it really impacts public opinion and public trust in their institutions. The most recent victimization and perceptions of public security survey done by INEGI, Mexico's Statistical Institute, had found that 93% of crimes in Mexico were not reported or were not investigated. So still a very high rate of crimes that no one knows about or are not really coming forward to authorities. And I think some of the key reasons of why, what was cited as why these crimes are not being denounced was that 34% of victims thought it was a waste of time. So, what's the point of going and lodging a complaint if nothing's going to happen? And another was about 16.5% had said they had lack of trust in authorities. And so I think just those two really point to a lot of the challenges facing Mexico's criminal justice institutions as they move forward on these very important reforms. And I would say, I think where the U.S. has been engaged even before the 2008 reforms were passed, USAID has been working on judicial reforms in states like Chihuahua since the early 2000s. I think just to highlight some of the ongoing shortcomings that a lot of analysts have seen of what needs to happen or what should be focused on with the new government and at the federal level, and also where the states need to go, is some of the entrenched bad practices that we see in criminal investigations. There continues to be an over-reliance on confessions to be presented as their main evidence. Linked to that is the continued use of torture as an investigative tool to obtain confessions or to obtain information. The excessive paperwork, like the whole, but Mexican trámites for informality of investigation, so lots of papers that need to get done that oftentimes just take up a lot of time and resources to be stamping and doing the paperwork. And I think lastly, and this points to the police issue as well, of loss of evidence that can be used in court due to poor handling of chain of custody and contamination of crime scenes. Is one area where there's a real link to the police question in Mexico, which is that in the 2008 reforms, Mexican police were granted a lot more faculties to be involved in criminal investigations, particularly in that first responder, as crime scene preservation and handling of evidence. And yet, in the training sequence, were sort of the last to be thought of in terms of what needed to be done. And I think that still continues to be one of the biggest concerns on the overall training of officials functioning within the criminal justice system, is the role of Mexico's police in criminal investigations and how they can be better equipped to make sure that evidence isn't being mishandled and then obviously can't be used in criminal investigations. Other areas have been the lack of independent forensic services. Oftentimes, the forensic experts feel tied to what the prosecutor wants them to produce, and a lack of coordination between public prosecutors, forensic experts, and investigative police. I think you look at a lot of stories and there's still a sense of competition amongst different officials instead of collaboration of how do you work better together. If anyone's interested, I think a really interesting series to read that kind of gives a clear picture of this is Animal Politico did a series last year. In English, it was Murder in Mexico, Guaranteed Impunity, Matar en México, Impunidad Garantizada, and it really analyzes from all the different people operating within the system a lot of the obstacles to investigating murders in Mexico. And I think part of it is, again, this this competition amongst officials, and certainly a lack of resources and a lack of adequate training. I think there are other kind of institutional areas that we need to see move forward with the new government, and we're still not clear on where all this will go, is who's coordinating all of the reforms of the criminal justice system. Until the 8-year transitory period ended, which was in 2016, there was a technical secretary to coordinate all the efforts to look at the criminal justice reform, the CETEC. Currently, or in the past government, it was all coordinated through the Executive Secretariat of the National Public Security System, which also meant that a lot of the focus was more on the public security side of things and not the whole overall criminal justice system. And being more flexible how federal funding and federal subsidies are being used at each state, because you look at the overall assessment of, well, we need more judges, we need more public prosecutors, more public defenders. It really depends on each state's needs. Some actually have better judges trained than others. Others maybe need more gaps in public defenders. And so I think looking at how do you have federal subsidies that are much more giving the states the flexibility to determine what they need to make their system fully operational, not these mandated efforts from the federal government. Addressing gaps in training, I think, is one of the key issues moving forward. It's also where the U.S. has been engaged, not just in basic training, but ongoing training for agents moving forward. And I think something that may be beneficial for the new government is how do you commit to really making progress on high-profile cases? I would say on a positive note this week, López Obrador announced on Tuesday they actually created the Presidential Commission for Truth and Justice in the case of the 43 disappeared students from Ayotzinapa. It was something he committed to. The first executive action he did as president was really getting this up and going to move forward with the court's resolutions on the case. I think it's another one where if this moves forward in the right way, it certainly sends a clear signal to the Mexican population of how do you go about conducting a very complex criminal investigation and an investigation that's linked to grave human rights violations in the country. And I think lastly, from sort of challenges we view, and obviously from an organization that also looks a lot at the human rights situation in Mexico and linked to López Obrador's agenda on peace and reconciliations, how do you work on the disappearance cases in Mexico? There are over 38,000 officially registered cases of disappeared people from 2007 onward. There's a new law, a general law on disappeared persons, that includes areas not just on searching for individuals and the identification, but also investigating those responsible. And I think that's just one of the big challenges within the criminal justice system is how do you provide answers to the thousands and thousands of families that really want at an immediate term to know where their loved ones are. And obviously, second is who is responsible and how do you go about investigating those cases? And I think an area, again, where we also see space for U.S. engagement, just to kind of look at overall U.S. support in terms of numbers, our calculations had estimated that the U.S. has provided over $400 million through the Merida Initiative since 2008 on training, courtroom infrastructure, and technical assistance to Mexico's criminal justice reforms. And so it's not a small investment. U.S. agencies have trained over 230,000 preventative police and 30,000 ministerial police throughout the country and equipped over 120 courtrooms. I think there's been a huge U.S. investment in this. One area we think moving forward is how do you adequately develop indicators to measure the success of this? I think particularly on training, the real concern that people can be trained, whether the training is as comprehensive as it needs to be, but also what happens to everybody that leaves the government later. So how do you really ensure a more better indicators of the impact that U.S. training is having and how it's complementing Mexico's own efforts? I think similar to this is how do you provide more technical assistance? The Department of Justice in particular and USAID have actually worked to accompany specific prosecutors on cases, and how do you work to ensure that sort of technical assistance at that level to help Mexican prosecutors get the skills to investigate technical cases. We were down in Villahermosa in Tabasco about a year and a half ago, and speaking to their prosecutor's office, the U.S. had been really effective in helping them set up a gender-based violence unit within the Fiscal General. I was looking at the numbers, and their number of cases have resolved have increased from 1 to 120, given, I think, some of that. So there's, I think, a real role to have still with U.S. technical assistance. Clearly, the Mexican government has to, want the U.S. to continue. I think that's obviously part of ongoing bilateral discussions of what that might look like. But we would certainly see that there is a role for the U.S. to continue with this assistance and training. and certainly supporting civil society and others as they work to monitor implementation of the criminal justice system moving forward. And I think even on disappearances, USAID has started to fund organizations and governments at the state level in Chihuahua, Nuevo León, to look at search for disappeared, and also working the fiscalias at the state level to investigate cases. And I think that's just an area where it's really important looking at providing answers to families. There's also several U.S. citizens that have disappeared in Mexico. And I think that the interest of the U.S. both supporting Mexico in its overall forensic services, but particularly on this one very humanitarian and very urgent issue, which is all of these disappeared people in the country. And then just to close off on the big change, which is the 2014 amendments to the Mexican Constitution, which established the creation of this Fiscalía General. Sort of Attorney General would be the same term, but it's had to distinguish it from the current Attorney General, usually called a National Prosecutor's Office, or the Fiscal, was a huge endeavor to really create an autonomous, independent body from the executive branch due to what was perceived as a lack of results and independence of the PGR, the Federal Attorney General's Office. With this, like the other fundamental element to the criminal justice reforms from 2008 was the Fiscalia, because it makes a lot of important decisions on criminal policy and priority for the entire country. And the autonomy part was really pushed for because it was believed that it would help remove any of the political influence over criminal investigations in Mexico, which has often impeded effective investigations from moving forward. 2 years later, actually on December 15th, the implementing law for the Fiscal General was actually passed by Mexican Congress and entered into force. It was published. I think the innovative parts of it are that it includes developing a plan on investigation and prosecutorial priorities. So establishing like what are the national priorities for criminal investigations moving forward. You have a much more flexible structure within the institution, so you're not siphoned off into different areas that don't communicate always with each other in terms of investigating criminal cases in Mexico, and pulling on different expertise from different teams. There are now only 4 special prosecutors' offices in Mexico for electoral crimes and corruption, which were in the original reforms. The law also includes a special prosecutor for human rights and internal affairs. I think it's the more innovative part of how do you investigate also wrongdoing or administrative failures within the institution itself, and creating special investigative commissions for emblematic cases, which we saw right now with the Presidential Commission, or the work being done on the Ayotzinapa case. The concerns about the reforms still are that the president can remove the Fiscal General, so the question of autonomy gets to, if your job's at stake, you still have that not necessarily as independent as organizations would like to see in terms of the new prosecutor, and pending reforms to the original constitutional reform that still allow everybody that was within the Attorney General's office, the PGR, to automatically transfer into the new Fiscalía General. And so I think there's a real need to develop indicators to purge members, looking at qualifications, but also investigations of individuals that have been linked to obstruction of justice, torture, and other illegal acts that we've seen in recent years. And I think also concerns about the budget. The budget that was passed at the end of the year had a 9% cut in the PGR's budget, and so certainly as you're looking at an overhaul of your criminal justice system, there's a concern about not having the resources needed to do that. As I said, today is an interesting day. Yesterday, the Senate submitted to López Obrador the 10 candidates that they had evaluated in a very abbreviated process of 15-minute hearings or presentations from each of the 27 candidates with no questions asked. But they did submit their list of candidates to López Obrador. It's expected he might send that back to them even today. 2 of the candidates are actually people that he had listed originally as of last January as being possible contenders for his own preference of who would be the Fiscal General. So I think likely someone that is close to the president. And we will see, I think, from that where that new fiscal puts the priorities in terms of the transition period and then moving forward. And I think also where we see a real opportunity for the U.S. to be supportive as Mexico does do the significant transformation of its criminal justice system, both at the state level and implementing the reforms, but also in the reforms of the Fiscal General. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Inigo.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maureen. Duncan and Eric, thank you for the invitation. As always, I love to participate with the Mexico Institute. You guys, really, your efforts to position Mexico issues in Washington, D.C. are outstanding, and there's no other institution, frankly, that comes near you. So kudos. I have a 17-point plan that we're going to go through. No, I'm just kidding. I've got a 3-point plan that we'll go through. Just basically talking about the main points in President López Obrador's promise in the regarding the change of the strategy on the war on drugs. So a lot of these, frankly, make some sort of a reminiscent from the previous change in administration, from the previous transition when the PRI came on board back in 2012. And I'll mention these specifically because there's a sense of deja vu in some of these, although with different language and different wording. But basically, López Obrador's first point, right, which is focusing on the underlying economic drivers that encourage ordinary Mexicans to participate in the illicit drug trade, is very similar to the PRI's plan back in 2012, which was based on the assumption that if you change the economic conditions, then suddenly crime will reduce itself. And that is, frankly, based on, I believe, a wrong analysis into why people engage in drug trafficking and in crime. It is not because of purely poverty or inequality in itself. It's because of the lack of opportunity. It's the lack of opportunity and the lack of prosperity to run their own businesses and to basically take charge of their own future. So I think that this as an ideal, as a national objective, is frankly something which is worthwhile to include. But it's frankly just a political statement because the state in itself doesn't really have that much capacity to control the economic conditions in the long term. So that's basically the first point. The second point, which was significantly different and was new, and it's based on offering amnesty to those some of the people involved in that segment, was frankly very polemic during the campaign period. But I don't see it become an issue. It's become a non-issue at this point. And no one seems to be concerned or at any point following whether that's being implemented or not. And the third point, which was moving away from the heavy reliance on the military for internal security forces. So that was the point. However, reality brings us to a completely different condition. This was the same point that Peña Nieto tried to push forward with the creation of the Gendarmerie, which is basically an intermediate force, right? A military-trained force with civilian oversight and law enforcement type of direction, which is now simply being called the National Guard. But in essence, it's the concept is relatively the same. So let's look at the last 6 years of the Peña Nieto administration, where the federal police was quite neglected. During all of the 6 years, it was put under the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretaría de Gobernación, and it did not grow. It actually contracted, both in numbers and in capabilities. While at the same time, the fight for the creation of the Gendarmerie took on very political dimensions, and it ended up in nothing. It ended up in a 4,000 person or maybe less unit under the federal police, but it did not become the solution. And in that point, everyone believed that, oh, the gendarmerie will frankly be the solution because it'll be the right force, trained, equipped, and capable to go after these cartels. It just didn't materialize. So right now, all of the eyes are on the National Guard, the creation of the National Guard. The concept of the National Guard is very likely going to be built up on existing military forces, which are going to be the military police, which the Army went about creating and expanding over the past 4 or 5 years when it saw that it didn't get command of the gendarmerie, so then they created the military police. While at the same time, the Navy set about also a structural change, which is very significant, and which was to become the national authority in all of Mexico's ports. So it was frankly fascinating to figure out how the Navy was suddenly learning how many ports there were in Mexico, right? And who ran these ports. So there's about 113 or 114 ports in Mexico, and the Navy had presence in about 19 of them. So creating a presence in 113 ports, which is going to demand a significant C4 ISR, a command control communications infrastructure to set in place to have the networking capabilities so that that presence is actually deployed with intelligence is going to be quite a big challenge over the next several years. So to enforce that, the Navy created the naval police, right? So now we have both the military police and the naval police being created over the past several years. The military police idea is to have 12 brigades, which are units composed of about 3,000, 3,200 troops stationed throughout Mexico, and the naval police runs about 5,000 naval police officers within the Navy. So then the new administration comes in and gets charged with creating a National Guard. So the instinctive decision is, well, let's see what's already been done, and let's just grab this and put it under an umbrella. The most likely scenario is that we're going to see these military police troops and naval police troops with bandanas that say National Guard. But they will, in essence, be doing the same internal security type of operations that they did over the past 3 or 4 years. Of course, materializing a new institution is going to take time. So I'd say let's wait and see, and let's see if this happens. If it does happen, if the National Guard does get to materialize, it's likely to look a lot like the Chilean Carabineros or the Italian Carabinieri, the French gendarmes. So that is definitely a type of force that should coexist with the federal police. But we should not neglect the fact that the federal police also needs to grow. And the state police also needs to grow. And there needs to be oversight and accountability. Basically, Mexico, what we're experiencing right now is a neglect of several decades where Mexico has not invested appropriately in the security sector. Are we in the right point regarding investment? No. The recent budget came out to 125 billion pesos for the armed forces, and that's the figure that I track because I track usually defense forces, which is equivalent to about $6.5 billion US, which means it's about 0.57% of Mexico's GDP. To give you an idea, globally, the expenditure on armed forces is 1.98% of the world's GDP. So Mexico is spending about a little bit over a fourth of what it should be spending just on armed forces. And that is just a really big void that's left not just for the armed forces, but for the rest of Mexico's law enforcement and civilian infrastructure. The other thing is Mexico's military needs to do military stuff as well, right? So they need to be involved in peacekeeping, in international peacekeeping. They do need to be able to provide surveillance of Mexico's very vast airspace. They do need to be out patrolling for submarines. And that is something that only the militaries can do. And those are, frankly, things that are currently lacking. Mexico's airspace coverage has recently expanded from 27 to 32%. That means that 70% of Mexico's airspace is the Wild West. And we haven't seen any real intentions being funded to go out and secure that rest of that airspace. Anyway, let's talk about the, I'm going to provide a couple of questions or comments on the paper. And frankly, I agreed with most of it, but I'm going to touch on some aspects that I think I had a little bit of something to say about it. So the change in the strategy on the risks of fragmentation and the idea of going to the middle part and basically not touching the heads of the cartels, I think I disagree in that. I think we need to take on an approach that includes the beheading cartels, and I mean that figuratively, maybe, but basically taking out not just the leadership, but also the middle part, because if you only concentrate on the middle part as well, there's plenty of grunts that are going to be wanting to buy in to become the operational guys. So it becomes a never-ending story. On the point of going for the money, I completely agree with that strategy. We should decrease the kinetic operations against the cartels, except the ones that are more violent, but increase it on going for the money. I'd really like to find out what the Financial Intelligence Unit, the WIF, did over the past 5 years. As I understand, the WIF, as of last year, had not been able to prosecute a single large case. And this is after we, and when I say we, I'm talking both as a Mexican and an American, have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the Financial Intelligence Unit. And the results are frankly not really visible. So I'm pretty sure that there's classification issues, etc. But I do think that the people deserve to know what this unit has been doing and what have all these trained analysts, are they still sticking around? Did they move over to the banking sector? Are they going to stay with the new austerity measures implemented by the government? I think those are some pretty good questions on that front. On intel sharing, I believe that it should obviously continue. We should expect a pause to some degree in the terms of the strategic intelligence sharing. And we saw that when the Peña Nieto administration came in, right? So if we saw the flows of intel sharing and exercises and just basic interaction between the security and the military forces. And then we get to 2013, we saw a pause, but then 2014, we saw it increase significantly, right? And it was on the right trajectory. So I think it's obvious that we should expect a pause during this year as it reorganizes, but it should ultimately continue. I'm not a big fan of sharing everything. I think that intelligence, particularly in criminal investigations, should be limited to a small team, high trust type of interactions. And I think that more and more, as both governments grow closer together, both in law enforcement and in the military, this is going to be a lot more possible. On the point of weapons trafficking, I agree that this needs to be a priority for the Mexican government. I believe that the checks and balances and the screening needs to increase, and the operations targeting the importation, the illegal importation of weapons and ammunition into Mexico needs definitely to increase, and for that it needs an international dimension. And for that, I mean, there needs to be an investigation into where these weapons are coming from, not just in specifically in the U.S., and basically trying to identify what the sources are and then hold the gun sellers accountable. I'm sure that they're with this much more closer degrees of cooperation, that is something that both governments can look at to increase. I don't think, frankly, that we need a new institution to do that. I think that it has to do a lot more with coordination between the existing institutions, so that the Navy and the Army and Customs and the federal police, etc., can launch an investigation to identify how these weapons are coming into Mexico and where they're coming from. And once they figure out where they're coming from, try to devise a legal action to take these out. Final point on anti-corruption. Austerity and security - justice reform, I think it's an oxymoron. We can't do security or justice reform with less. It's simply unachievable. By reducing, trying to reduce corruption while at the same time reducing salaries is really difficult to implement. So in the case of corruption, Mexico doesn't need austerity, it needs an exorcist, frankly. And by exorcist, I mean an excess of technology, specialized training, and a very strong operational foundation to go after corruption. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. I'd really like to pick up, first of all, with the point on which Indigo ended, which is about the real challenge of money. Throughout the lifespan of the Merida Initiative, people have said, look, it's a lot of money that's being allocated, but it's a tiny percentage of what Mexico spends itself. Do you, all three of you, maybe you could respond to this. I mean, is there a real need, and would it make a difference if the United States were to commit vastly greater amounts of resources to a security cooperation initiative? And then I have three questions, one for each of you. Maureen, I'd really like to hear a little bit more from you about sort of the role that you see civil society playing in defining security and justice reform policy in Mexico. We all know that the new government in Mexico has a complicated relationship with civil society, shall we say, or at least some elements of civil society. Eric, I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on, you talked about Central America as a very important area of the paper. How is it that Mexico and the United States can work together in or on Central America? I mean, this is one of the big issues that has arisen so far out of the Andrés Manuel López Obrador administration. And Indigo, talk a little bit, if you can, just about something that you've written extensively about in the past, which is military-to-military collaboration. And that's been one of the bright spots of the security collaboration story of the past 10 years. As we've said many times here at the Wilson Center, the level of cooperation that we see today was unthinkable 10 years ago. Is that being preserved? Do you see that will continue to deepen, or is it going to be sort of put on hold for a while? So, Maureen, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Duncan. On the U.S., I don't know if it's a need for the U.S. to commit significant more resources. I think it's continuing to commit resources to work with Mexico. I mean, one thing we've heard repeatedly from U.S. officials is we can offer lots of things. Mexico has to also propose and decide what they want, and I think this is clearly a period when the new government will determine where they want to see cooperation going forward. Indigo alluded to the fact that with the Peña Nieto government, I think we saw about a year, almost a pause in cooperation as they assessed what they wanted from the United States. And so I think it's one, deciding what that cooperation will look like and continued U.S. commitment to work with Mexico. Maybe not. I think that the big ticket items that we saw in the first few years of the Merida Initiative were helicopters, surveillance planes, things I think probably now aren't as necessary in terms of they were allocated. Now it's a lot. I think you can do more with less if you're looking at technical assistance, ongoing training, and not necessarily these big hardware items that we saw in the first few years of assistance. To answer the second, I think, role of civil society, it's been very interesting to see lately. We are part of both the Colectivo de Fiscalía que Sirva, which has been looking at, the whole overhaul of the PGR, really pushing for autonomous prosecutor. I think it's had a key role in pushing Mexican Congress or showing concern about the way the process is moving forward, particularly in the Senate, in terms of lack of a real full assessment of the candidates. I think moving forward, it is more on monitoring the implementation of the reforms of the Fiscalía. A lot of organizations participated with the transition team in developing a proposal for the law, the implementing law. So I think now it's using all of that technical expertise that they have to really work on monitoring and providing assistance when asked to see where this goes and what it will look like moving forward. The same with the National Guard. The Seguro Sin Guerra Colectivo has been very active in recent days on this. Many of the members participated in hearings in the Mexican Congress last week and expressed a lot of concern about the model and about the implications of a further militarization of public security. I think now it's also, depending on, it was passed in the House last night, or the Cámara last night, it's going to the Senate. Whatever that final body looks like, it's also, I think, how do you provide more monitoring and oversight, because there are serious human rights concerns about the new force in terms of linkages to both military and federal police having been implicated in grave human rights violations, to areas of accountability overall. So is there a role to really look at oversight and monitoring and proposing on what needs to move forward? And I think just lastly, I think civil society has a key role on disappearances, not to beat the thing over the head, but I think family members, the colectivos of disappeared, have been very instrumental in both having a national law on disappearances actually on the books and now really working to implement the law. And I think they are going to be key, both civil society organizations that support families, but the families themselves in pushing the government on moving forward with these issues.
Thank you, Maureen. Eric, I know you had a point that you wanted to add to your earlier remarks, as well as responding to my excellent question.
Well, now that I've had time to reflect on what I've said, I just wanted to, and Indigo actually hit on some of them. I in my effort to be quick and concise, I totally jumped over the issue of focus on illicit financing. And I have a good friend and former colleague, Allison Cordell, here worked in this field, and I thought, how could I forget to mention this? So it's really, really important, and I think we include in the paper 7 suggestions of areas that need to be focused, but Indigo is right. I mean, this has been on the agenda for a long time. The Trump administration's own policy Declared policy is to focus on TCO financing, transnational criminal organization financing. It's one thing to say those words, it's another thing to actually do it, and we need to really take a hard look at what's being done. Some of the proposals in the paper around this had to do with the integration between financial intelligence and law enforcement operations. And I think sometimes these operate in parallel universes, right? Regulators, people are looking at banks, may make cases on their own, but using some of that financial intelligence in law enforcement operations is certainly one element there. The other proposal was to focus on financiers of transnational criminal organizations as a target as well, because they are specialized, they are not easily replaced. You can replace the guy who moves cocaine from southern Mexico to northern Mexico. Those are replaced. Financiers are not so easily replaceable, so focusing on those, I think, is really important. And this goes to your initial criticism, which is very valid of the paper. I think we don't want to say kingpin, middle, either or, you do this or you do that. I think we're just simply saying we need to look at both. Chapo Guzman should be in jail, should be being prosecuted, but that can't be the totality or the main part of our strategy, and it's sort of evolved in that direction. Under Peña Nieto, there were some scorecards, and these are the guys that we've extradited. That's all fine, but we need to look more at the middle areas as well, not as an either or, but both together. Now, to your brilliant and well thought out questions.
Thank you, sir.
Flattery will get you everywhere. Resources. Listen, as I've been meeting with people in Congress the last few weeks, my general sense is that there would be a lot of appetite for more resources for this kind of security work in Mexico. But Maureen hits it on the head. Is there an appetite on the part of Mexico to accept more resources, and in some ways more U.S. involvement in their security landscape? And that really is the challenge. My own sense is that the urgency of building, governance at the local level is very obvious. Sometimes that becomes incredibly politically sensitive in Mexico, so there's a resistance to that kind of resources. The other point I would make is the value of the Merida Initiative, or this framework of shared responsibility is really what I should talk about, is not just in the amount of money. We can't say, oh, it's a success because it was $5 billion, $10 billion, or $1 billion. It's in how the countries work together and begin to build these synergies in addressing these issues. So I think we should focus on that. More money would be useful if there's a commitment and a clear strategy. I just think open-ended resources or more money is not the solution. And on the issue of Central America, look at, in general, and not to be too shorthand here, in general, the analysis has been that the focus needs to be on the drivers of migration, which are put into three baskets, right? The opportunity question, the question of economics, and people's sense of despair over not being able to provide for their families has got to be addressed. Secondly, the question of security. These countries that have much higher homicide rates than even Mexico. So that's clearly at the core. The third element is governance and how, again, you build democratic governance in countries where impunity rates are very high. You have court systems that don't function, police that are corrupt. I think those still are legitimate. Unfortunately, I have to say, and this is a criticism I have of the Trump administration, is they've sort of dropped the democratic governance agenda. We've had 2 conferences now in Central America, prosperity and security. Where's the governance agenda? It's kind of disappeared. So I think we need to recapture that. Now, let me just make this one last final point on Central America. And this is actually in the paper. If Mexico is going to engage in Central America, which I think it should more than it is now, it has a credibility problem of its own that it needs to address. One is the corruption issue, obviously, but the other is the treatment of Central American migrants in Central America. I'm not talking just about what's going on in Tijuana with the caravan, et cetera. There's a long history of abuse and exploitation of Central American migrants coming through Mexico, certainly by criminal organizations, but also by local and state authorities, federal authorities that extort them, that threaten them, that abuse them. I mean, that's well documented, even by government institutions in Mexico. And so, got to address that issue as well if you want to have a credible voice in Central America.
Thank you, Eric. Indigo.
Great, thank you. Yes, well, on mill-to-mill cooperation, completely agree with Duncan. 10 years ago, it was frankly unthinkable that we could reach to the current levels. Back then, I remember most of the questions that I got from Mexican military officers were, why should we cooperate with the Americans that took half our territory away? Right, that was the basic underlining. About 5 years in, the question shifted, and the question was, how can we cooperate? And now, the past couple of years, the question is, what else can we do? Right. So it's interesting to note that in an age where political rhetoric travels at the speed of Twitter, the most stable relationship between both governments are now at the military sphere. Back in October, Secretary Mattis went in and was present at the Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas in Cancun. And he came basically on board saying, I'm right here, and I brought with me the commander of Southcom, the commander of Northcom, the DASD, the head of the Perry Center, the head of the Inter-American Defense College, just to show you how important this relationship is. So I think that in that sense, the U.S. has placed Mexico in somewhat of a different sphere and a much more closer sphere, and I believe that is going to continue at least over the next couple of years, if there is the political will to continue that on the part of Mexico. We've seen, and the U.S., we've seen that relationship continue to be strengthened, or at least continue during even the Trump administration. So let's see if so far it survived Trump. Let's see if it survives AMLO as well. Yeah, basically. Thanks.
I'd like to take some questions from our audience. Who would like to venture forth? One over here, please. Can we get a microphone for you? Thank you.
I have one very specific question in regards to...
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, yes, sure. I'm Sharon. I work for the government sector in the IDB, specifically with Haiti, so strengthening their institutions and providing better services in agriculture and transportation. So my questions is with regards to, it's for Indigo. It's very specific. It's just that he mentioned how should we track better the weapons, and I ask, what is the specific role of the ATT right now in Mexico? What is the cooperation? How they're actually improving the way they track the arms?
You mean the Arms Trade Treaty?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Any other questions from our audience? Yes, please, sir.
Hi, I'm David Johnson. Everything that's wrong with Merida is my fault. That's probably
David Johnson is the former Assistant Secretary of INL, and I've been a good friend and come to many of our events. Thank you for coming, David. And we're not blaming it all on you, by any stretch.
I was intrigued, Eric, by your comment about focusing on local areas, and one of the issues, challenges with Merida is trying to do everything across the country systemically. Is there any appetite for perhaps focusing on the urban areas along the border and trying to make them rule of law zones, where you could concentrate resources and try to actually have a measurable and more rapid impact? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a third question from Ali Cordell?
Hello.
Second, Ali, okay?
Johanna Schnitzler, Department of Homeland Security, but furloughed, so non-official capacity. Trying to stay busy.
Thank you for being here.
So I was interested about the how you all mentioned amnesty for people who had some sort of involvement in cartels. And I want to know how you gauge the appetite amongst Mexican citizens for this sort of amnesty. Do you think they would be welcome to incorporating them into professional spheres and in their society in general?
Thank you. And then we're going to take one last question down here from Alison Cordell.
Hi, I'm Allison Cordell. I work at the Financial Integrity Network, but most importantly in this room, I started my career in D.C. working at the Mexico Institute.
And despite that, has been successful. It's incredible, really.
Working on it. Thank you, Indigo and Eric, for discussing illicit finance in Mexico. My colleague Arch and I spent a lot of time working with clients in Mexico on this very issue. And so my question for you, Indigo and Eric, where do you think the fault lines are in reaching that ultimate indicator of improvement in the AML, CFT world, of convictions, high-level cases? Do you think it's in the regulatory framework? Do you think it's in capacity at the regulatory level or in the banking sector or the banking sector? Or do you think it's will to pursue some of the tough cases or another factor? Thank you.
Thank you. So, why don't we go from left to right? Inigo, why don't you kick off?
Great, thank you. Sharon, on your questions about, and thank you for your question on the ATT. The Mexican military has actually engaged with Haiti recently into supporting the creation of the Haitian armed forces, basically because of their role in creating a role for the disaster response capacity. Looking at an armed force as a tool of the state more than just a defense force. In terms of the ATT, its impact in Mexico has frankly been, I have nothing to say. Right? Its impact in terms of the continued flows of weapons into Mexico has been, frankly, absolutely nothing at this point. The flows have continued at the same rate as they have, a same increasing rate. A study which a colleague and I put together a couple of years ago, we came up with a figure of about 25 million weapons in Mexico, of which about 2 million were legal. So we're looking at plus 90%. So that has basically been the continued flow on that end. I haven't seen at least any focus from the military, which has the main counter weapon authority, in them really stepping up their operations against that up to now. In terms of your point on what has been lacking in Mexico regarding this, I frankly think it's political will. I'm gonna go way out there and say that Mexican law is usually ambiguously written for a reason, and it's something that comes from Mexico's virreinal. How would you say that? Mexico's colonial time. Yes, from Mexico's colonial time, right? Which when they would receive instructions or new laws from Spain, the instruction was aplíquese mas no se acate, right? So implement but not actually operationalize. So I'm gonna go out way on a limb on that point. I think it's been a lack of political will to go out and get it. I think the technical skills are there. I think there's the legal instruments. But if in Mexico, if you don't want something to happen, you simply follow the law or interpret the law in a very specific way so that it just doesn't materialize.
Well, thank you. Maureen.
All right. Thanks. A few things. On the focus on urban areas along the border, and Eric, you may have more. I think INL has had several priority states in terms of northern Mexico, Baja California, Chihuahua, Nuevo León. Big challenge is Tamaulipas, where I think U.S. officials are very restricted in terms of any movement. But I think there has been, particularly, we were visiting the consulate in Ciudad Juarez about 2 or 3 years ago, a lot of work on police professionalization at the state level in several municipalities in Chihuahua, and a lot of the violence prevention programs are also working on like cities like Tijuana and elsewhere. That could be expanded, I would suspect. On amnesty, I think one, there has been a history in Mexico. There have been amnesties in the past in terms of the Zapatista uprising, to recent, I think, protests that happened when Peña Nieto took office, of like giving amnesty to certain people afterwards, given the type of penalties or crimes they were accused of. I think, given the fact that the Minister of the Interior, Olga Sanchez Cordero, has been very clear, she tried to clarify what that would look like and made it clear it's not for grave human rights violations, homicides. I think really looking at the direction it's going, there hasn't been the pushback there may have been in the original when it's proposed of amnesty for everybody or drug traffickers. I think one area that may move forward that she's interested in, and there's a lot of organizations, including WOLA, actually working on, is women in incarceration, and the fact there's a lot of women in jail for nonviolent crime or drug offenses. And so looking at how do you gradually work on amnesty for certain populations that I think have a larger support from the Mexican population of why should they still be in jail for the type of crimes they've been accused of. And so there's likely to be sort of gradual working on amnesty. I think there's also been a lot of discussion in Mexico about transitional justice models for what has been the past decade or more of the war on drugs, or however you want to frame it, where there's work on truth commissions or other types of coming to terms with the past. And I think amnesty has also come up sometimes there of, would someone an halcón, like a lookout, who knows a lot about what happened to people, what kind of types of amnesty or something, other models could be helpful to provide more of those answers that people are really looking for to understand what's happened. So I think we'll see, but I think there is likely to be some movement, just depends on the issue. And I wanted to touch on your point, Eric, on Central American migration, because I think one of the key things we have seen so far is a shift in the new government is how they're talking about Central American migration, not just on working with Central American governments on this integral development plan and promising to look at either more resources or attracting foreign investment both to southern Mexico and to Central America, but the change in how they speak about migration and Mexico's role. I think Olga Sanchez spoke at the meeting of the ambassadors and consuls earlier last week about the fact that Mexico cannot have a policy that's working to promote the rights of their citizens abroad without really looking at how you're promoting the rights of migrants in Mexico itself. Tonatiuh Guillén, the new head of the Immigration Institute, is also very clear of wanting to really focus on respecting rights of migrants. What that means on the ground, I think there's lots of challenges, as you allude to, in terms of really investigating any of the criminal networks and others that are preying on migrants in Mexico. But I think particularly on going after government officials, including within the immigration agency and others that have been involved in abuse or corruption or crimes against migrants, hopefully we'll see more progress on that, because it does seem like a very vocal and very shift in terms of how the new government is talking about what they're going to do to protect migrants that are in the country.
Thank you, Maureen. Eric, bring us home.
Again, thank you, David. That's a great question. If you look at the map of homicides in Mexico, what jumps out at you is that at border cities and port cities, which are also border cities, just not at the line between, are usually the ones with the highest homicide rates. And so at some level, I think it's absolutely appropriate to try to think about border cities as a place where we need to implement this localized strategy. Localized, but that integrates both federal, state, and local and international support. There was a bit of that experience in Ciudad Juarez, if as you will recall, during the whole Todos Somos Juarez period, where federal investment and a local involvement, not only of local government and state government, but also local private sector, local professional groups, civil society, all really came together around a strategy. Now, we could debate endlessly about how effective that was, whether it's a sustainable model, et cetera, but I think it was a good experience from which we can learn a great deal about how to try to do this and approach this from various levels. The example of Tijuana is quite different because they didn't have that kind of multi-sectoral approach. It was a more hard law enforcement approach. They had some success, although last year 1 out of 10 murders in Mexico occurred in Tijuana, which is pretty stunning when you think about the level of violence that's returned to Tijuana. It's returning in Juarez as well. All that to say is that these things aren't magic wands. They need to be sustained over time. There needs to be care to continue the model of an integrated approach from all levels of government. One thing I was going to say is that in our discussion about localized approaches, there were two cases that were brought forward. The case of the capital city of Morelia in Michoacan, where the mayor, the presidente municipal, and some of his people really did turn the corner around, turns things around locally on their own by reaching out to communities and being more accessible and more responsive to the needs of people in the neighborhoods. And then the experience in Morelos, too, which is clearly not ideal and perfect in every way, but there was a local effort to empower municipalities within the state of Morelos that showed some real signs of turning around as well. All this to say is that we need to learn from those experiences how to do this from multiple levels of government and sustain it over a longer period of time. It includes law enforcement, prosecution, but also social investments that are specifically targeted to the needs of the communities hardest hit by violence. I take Indigo's point. I agree absolutely. Social investment, poverty reduction in and of themselves aren't going to impact violence directly. Those links are pretty limited. You can do specific targeted programs to reduce violence and deal with social issues, but they have to be very focalized and very targeted to those populations. And so that's, I think, the direction we would recommend.
Thank you very much to our panelists, to you, the audience. I would like to mention that on February 12th, we will have our annual Mexico Security and Rule of Law Forum here at the Wilson Center. We'll be presenting a couple of new papers then, focusing on specifically on fentanyl, one on Mexico's role in the fentanyl trade, and secondly, how fentanyl is impacting upon the heroin and other opioid industry from Mexico to the United States. So please stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for coming out today. A round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Thank you.